What if your best years of strength and health weren't behind you, but just beginning? Frank Miller stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror, blinking as if the words hadn't yet fully sunk in. It was early morning, just after sunrise. The house was still silent, save for the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. He could almost hear the distant sounds of his own body creaking as he bent down to tie his shoes. His legs were stiff, his back sore from years of neglect, and his joints, well, they weren't as young as they used to be. He had never thought of himself as old, at least, not until recently. There was a time when he used to feel invincible, back when he was building complex machines for NASA, or even when he had worked on high-tech systems for defense contractors. But those days felt like a distant memory now, overshadowed by the quiet solitude of his retirement. Frank was 67, a widower for the past 5 years, and had become comfortable in his routine: early mornings, long afternoons spent reading or watching TV, and evenings alone with his thoughts. But this morning, something was different. The simple, mundane act of getting ready for the day had triggered a thought. A question. What if it wasn't too late to change? The question had come to him only days before, while sitting in his favorite armchair, sipping a cup of coffee. He had just finished listening to an episode of the Joe Rogan Experience, where Elon Musk, the man who had turned space travel and electric cars into reality, spoke about optimizing human life. He hadn't paid much attention to the idea at first. After all, why would someone like Musk care about the aging process of a retired engineer? But then, something Musk had said stuck with him. You can hack the body just like you hack a system. If we can revolutionize transportation and space, why not optimize the way we age? Frank had thought about it for a moment. Could there really be a way to hack his own body? Could he reclaim the strength and vitality he'd lost over the years? Could he possibly start fresh, like a system in need of a reboot? For the first time in a long while, he felt a spark of curiosity. It was more than just a fleeting thought. It was a challenge, an idea that demanded to be tested. What if Frank Miller, an engineer with a passion for innovation, could take the same approach Musk took to space exploration and apply it to his own life? He stood there in front of the mirror, staring at his reflection as the question circled in his mind. What if this was just the beginning? The question felt weighty, almost absurd. After all, wasn't he too old for this? Didn't his body have its limits? His knees had started to creak just a few years ago. His back had begun to stiffen. And the fact that he had fallen down the stairs last week, bruising his ribs, wasn't exactly a confidence booster. His body seemed to be betraying him, little by little. And yet, the idea of aging without giving up, of finding a new way to be stronger, seemed almost impossible to ignore. It was then that the next thought came. Is there a way to do this without a gym? Something simple, something smart, something that doesn't take up my entire day. The gym had never been Frank's scene. He was the kind of man who enjoyed solving problems with his mind, not by lifting heavy weights. Even in his youth, he never thought of himself as someone who needed to work out. But now, with his body reminding him that it was no longer in its prime, he wondered if he could find a way to optimize it without ever stepping foot in a gym. As he finished tying his shoes and stood up, he knew one thing for certain: this wasn't just some passing thought. It was the start of something. Frank grabbed his phone and sent a quick text to his son, Josh. What do you think about applying the Elon Musk approach to aging? A smarter way to build muscle without a gym. Could it work? Josh's response came almost immediately. Dad, that sounds like a crazy idea, but hey, if Musk can revolutionize space and cars, why not? The encouragement from his son was all Frank needed. For the first time in months, he felt a sense of purpose rising inside him. There was a challenge ahead of him, and it wasn't about fixing a car or optimizing a machine. It was about fixing himself. About rebuilding the most important system he'd ever worked on, his own body. Frank didn't wait for a second longer. He opened his laptop and started searching. First, he looked for ways to build muscle as you age. Then, he searched for hacks, anything that didn't require hours at the gym. He read about resistance bands, bodyweight exercises, and the importance of high-intensity interval training for seniors. He began to feel a sense of excitement he hadn't felt in years. This was it. This was the challenge he needed. This was his version of hacking the system. But of course, he knew there was more to it than just finding exercises. He had to take it slow, test it out, and make sure it worked. He'd never been one to jump into something without research and preparation. This would be no different. Frank smiled to himself as he closed his laptop and headed into the kitchen to grab breakfast. He hadn't felt this alive in a long time. It wasn't just about improving his body. It was about proving to himself that he wasn't done yet. Maybe the best years were ahead of him after all. As Frank began his morning routine, he realized that the hardest part was already behind him. He had asked the question. And that had set everything else in motion. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Frank Miller sat down at the kitchen table, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. His fingers traced the edge of the mug absent-mindedly as he stared out the window at the quiet street outside. It had been like this for years, peaceful, almost eerily calm, with the occasional sound of birds chirping in the trees. This was his life now. No more deadlines, no more team meetings, no more flights to strange places to oversee new projects. After retiring from a 40-year career as an aerospace engineer, Frank found himself alone in the house he once shared with his wife, Helen. The house, a modest 3-bedroom ranch tucked away in a quiet suburban neighborhood, still felt like home in many ways, but in others, it was empty. Helen had passed away 5 years ago, and Frank still couldn't quite shake the feeling of her absence. They'd been together for over 40 years, married young, built a life, raised a son, and grew old together. She had been his constant, his partner in everything. Helen had always been the one who pushed him to live a little. She had insisted they go on spontaneous road trips, even when Frank preferred to stay in the comfort of their home, buried in books or tinkering with some new project. She was the adventurous one, the one who reminded him that life wasn't just about work. She'd even dragged him to the gym once or twice. But Frank had never really embraced fitness. He was more of the brain-over-brawn type, and besides, he'd been too busy with his career to worry about his physical health. But now, looking back, Frank could see that those were the days when his body had been at its peak. The late nights spent drafting designs for cutting-edge aircraft and the long hours spent in the workshop had kept him in good shape, partly because his mind was always moving and partly because the job demanded it. But as his work life wound down and he transitioned into retirement, Frank realized his body wasn't quite as resilient as it used to be. His knees creaked when he got up in the morning. His back ached if he stood for too long. He felt the weight of the years pressing down on him in a way that hadn't been there before. And then there was the fall. It had been a stupid accident. He'd been hurrying down the stairs one morning to get the paper, not paying attention to his footing. He'd slipped, landing hard on his side. The bruising had been minor, but it had rattled him. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened. Frank was no stranger to getting older, but this time, the fall felt different. It felt like a warning. His body, once so strong and capable, was beginning to betray him. But perhaps it was more than just his body. Maybe it was his mind, too. When Helen was alive, Frank had been more active. He'd always had a sense of purpose. They'd gone on long walks, done projects together, and enjoyed their quiet evenings as a couple. But now, Frank's purpose seemed to have evaporated with her passing. Josh, his son, had tried to help. He was busy, of course, living in the city, working long hours as a tech consultant. Still, he'd made an effort to check in on his father. Frank had always been proud of Josh, who'd inherited his problem-solving mindset and his drive. But while Josh was thriving in the tech world, Frank was stuck in a rut, unable to find the spark that had once driven him to achieve great things. Josh had always been the kind of person who embraced new technologies, new ways of thinking. He'd been obsessed with Elon Musk since his early 20s, following every update about Tesla, SpaceX, and even Musk's ideas on human enhancement. Frank had never been particularly interested in those things. To him, Musk was a visionary, yes, but also a bit of an eccentric. He'd seen Josh's excitement and wondered what all the fuss was about. But then, that podcast episode had changed everything. The thought of Musk's approach to life, to biohacking, had planted a seed in Frank's mind. What if there was a way to apply that kind of thinking to his own life? What if there was a way to hack his body, to optimize it in the same way Musk had optimized technology? Frank wasn't just a passive observer. He was an engineer, after all. He knew how to break things down, analyze them, and rebuild them in better ways. Why couldn't he do that with his own body? This wasn't the first time Frank had thought about fitness or health. In the past, Helen had tried to drag him to the gym, but he'd always resisted. "I don't have time for that," he'd said. Or, "I'll just walk around the neighborhood." But now, he had time. And with his growing curiosity about what Musk had done for technology, Frank wondered if there was a better way to take care of himself, one that didn't require hours at the gym or complicated routines that he'd never stick with. He needed to do something. But what? As he sat at the table, sipping his coffee, Frank felt a renewed sense of purpose. The research he'd started the night before, about bodyweight exercises, resistance bands, and micro-workouts, had made him feel more hopeful than he had in years. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as far gone as he'd thought. Maybe he could build muscle again, regain his strength, and feel like himself once more. Josh had already sent a message of encouragement. Frank smiled as he read it again. "If Musk can revolutionize space and cars, why not?" his son had said. It wasn't about the gym. It wasn't about getting back to his youth. It was about taking control of his own body again, using the same mindset that had helped him solve so many problems in his career. And just like the early days of his engineering career, Frank knew it wouldn't be easy. There would be setbacks, mistakes, and times when he'd want to give up. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like there was something worth fighting for. Something that had nothing to do with the past and everything to do with the future. He stood up, determined. He wasn't done yet. This was just the beginning. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen window as Frank stood in front of his laptop, scrolling through articles and videos. His fingers hovered over the keyboard as he searched for new ideas, techniques, anything that would help him take control of his body. The initial excitement from the night before had only grown, and now he was ready to take the first step. "All right, let's get started," he muttered to himself, taking a deep breath. The idea of working out at his age had always seemed like a daunting, distant task. He had no intention of going to a gym, where young fitness enthusiasts with their perfect physiques seemed to mock his every move. Frank wasn't about to throw himself into something that would make him feel out of place. Instead, he'd find a smarter way, an Elon Musk way. The first thing he needed to figure out was a plan. So, Frank began his research on bodyweight exercises. He found articles that recommended everything from push-ups to squats, to lunges and resistance band exercises. The more he read, the more intrigued he became. There were so many options, so many ways to approach his new goal. What struck him the most was the focus on consistency. It wasn't about pushing himself to exhaustion every day, or about spending hours at the gym. No, it was about building a routine, small, sustainable efforts that added up over time. "Maybe I'm too old for this," he muttered, sitting on the edge of his bed and massaging his shoulder. His mind flashed to the times when he used to fix problems with his hands, when a simple adjustment or tweak would get things back on track. Why should this be any different? But then he remembered his research. The trainers, the success stories, the scientific studies, everything had emphasized patience. "You've got to start slow," Frank told himself, standing up and walking to the kitchen for some breakfast. "One step at a time. Just like with any project. That afternoon, Frank decided to rest. He wouldn't push himself too hard. Instead, he focused on making adjustments to his routine. He would work on lighter exercises, allowing his body to recover. This wasn't about speed, it was about long-term success. By the end of the second week, Frank found himself feeling more confident. His shoulder had healed, and he had developed a rhythm. He had stopped comparing himself to the younger version of himself and started to appreciate the small victories, the way his legs felt stronger after a few squats, the slight toning in his arms, the way his posture improved as he walked through the house. There was still a long way to go, but Frank could see the progress. And every day, he reminded himself, it wasn't about perfection. It was about moving forward, one day at a time. As Frank looked out the window later that evening, his mind wandered back to the podcast. The idea of biohacking, of using science and technology to optimize his life, had resonated with him. It wasn't just about getting stronger, it was about being smarter. Frank had spent his whole career solving complex problems, optimizing systems, and now, he was applying that same mindset to his own life. If Elon Musk could revolutionize space and electric cars, why couldn't Frank revolutionize his own body? Frank smiled as he leaned back in his chair. He wasn't done yet. This was just the beginning. Frank had made a habit of starting each morning with his workout, just as he had promised himself. The routine had become a grounding force in his life, the one thing he could count on in a world that sometimes felt a bit too uncertain. But even with this newfound consistency, the road ahead wasn't as smooth as he had hoped. This particular morning, Frank was struggling. His body was sore, his legs felt like lead, his back stiff from the previous day's workout. The usual sense of pride and accomplishment after his morning routine had been replaced with frustration. Maybe I'm not cut out for this, he muttered, standing in front of the bathroom mirror, trying to stretch out his lower back. His thoughts drifted back to his younger years. He hadn't had to think about stretching or soreness back then. His body had simply done what it needed to do, day after day. But now, at 68, it seemed like everything was more complicated. No matter how much he tried, there was always a twinge of discomfort, a reminder that his body wasn't what it used to be. But Frank wasn't one to give up easily. No, giving up was never an option, especially after all the time he had spent building his engineering career. If he could solve complex problems in the aerospace industry, surely he could solve this. It was time to take a step back and reassess. Frank opened his laptop, once again searching for ways to optimize his workout routine. His focus had always been on solutions, not on obstacles. His son Josh had sent him a text the night before, "Dad, make sure you're listening to your body. Sometimes less is more, you know." Frank hadn't responded to the text yet, but he knew Josh was right. Maybe he was pushing himself too hard, too fast. Perhaps the secret was in taking things slower, focusing more on recovery and stretching than on trying to increase intensity so quickly. After browsing through a few more videos, Frank stumbled upon something that caught his eye: the importance of mobility work for seniors. It seemed like exactly what he needed. The video explained how, as people age, they often lose flexibility and mobility, which contributes to pain and stiffness. And the key to alleviating that, the instructor explained, was incorporating mobility exercises into the daily routine. Frank had never paid much attention to mobility before. He had always been focused on strength and endurance, but maybe this was the missing piece of the puzzle. He clicked on the video and watched as the instructor demonstrated simple, yet effective movements to improve joint mobility, slow, controlled movements designed to increase flexibility without overexerting the body. The exercises weren't intense, but Frank could already tell they were something he needed. These movements weren't about pushing to the limit, they were about restoring his body's natural range of motion. With a renewed sense of purpose, Frank rolled out his yoga mat and followed along with the instructor's demonstrations. He moved slowly through each exercise, paying close attention to how his body felt. The simple motions, shoulder rolls, hip circles, and ankle stretches, felt soothing, almost meditative. The tension in his back began to ease, and for the first time in a while, he felt a wave of relief. By the time the 10-minute session ended, Frank was surprised by how much better he felt. His body wasn't completely pain-free, but it was definitely looser, more open. The soreness he had woken up with had subsided, replaced by a sense of comfort and ease. "Not bad," he said to himself, smiling. "I'll add this to the routine." The next few days were a mix of mobility work and bodyweight exercises. Frank was careful not to overdo it, incorporating longer rest periods and listening to his body's feedback. His body wasn't as quick to recover as it had been when he was younger, but it was recovering. And with each session, Frank noticed more progress. His hips felt less tight, his shoulders less stiff. The constant aches and pains he'd become used to were starting to fade, bit by bit. But as the weeks went on, Frank realized something he hadn't expected: this wasn't just about the physical benefits anymore. There was something else happening. A shift in his mindset. Before, Frank had viewed his aging body as a burden, something that was inevitably decaying, slipping away from him. But now, as he moved through his daily routine, he started to think of his body not as something to fight against, but as a project to improve, to nurture. Each day became an opportunity to optimize, just like the engineering projects he used to work on. This was his new mission. One afternoon, as Frank was finishing up a set of squats, he felt a familiar sense of accomplishment. His legs weren't just stronger, they were also moving more freely. His balance had improved. He felt more stable on his feet, and the aches that had plagued him for so long were fading into the background. He paused and looked in the mirror, studying his reflection. "I'm not done yet," Frank said with a grin. Not by a long shot. But there was still more to tackle. The road ahead wasn't all smooth sailing, as he'd come to realize. He wasn't going to build muscle overnight. There would be days when his body didn't feel as strong, when the soreness returned, or when progress seemed slow. But that was okay. Frank had learned something important in the past few weeks. Fitness wasn't a race. It was a journey, a long, continuous process of improving, of adapting, of learning. And with each day, Frank felt more and more in control. He wasn't going to let age dictate his life. He was going to take charge of his body, using the tools at his disposal, just like he had in his engineering career. One problem at a time. One solution at a time. Frank smiled to himself as he walked into the kitchen to make lunch. For the first time in years, he felt the kind of hope that had fueled him during his career, hope that, with time and effort, he could truly change his life. And this time, he wasn't doing it alone. It was a cool, breezy morning when Frank woke up feeling unusually sluggish. For the first time in weeks, the pain he had worked so hard to overcome had returned. His lower back was stiff, and his knees ached in a way that he hadn't experienced in the past month. He could feel the weight of the setback settling in before he even opened his eyes. "Not today," he muttered under his breath as he swung his legs off the bed and stood up. He tried to stretch, but his body refused to cooperate. Frank had always prided himself on being the kind of person who could push through physical discomfort. But this was different. His body didn't just feel tired, it felt broken. A sense of frustration washed over him, and for a moment, he wondered if maybe this whole fitness thing wasn't worth it after all. He shuffled into the kitchen, his mind clouded with doubt. What if I've pushed too hard, he thought, his gaze lingering on the cup of coffee he hadn't even reached for yet. Maybe I'm just too old for this. Maybe I should accept it. But something inside Frank resisted the idea of giving up. He had spent years of his life building a successful career, solving problems, and pushing boundaries. Why should this be any different? It wasn't that Frank wanted to quit, he simply didn't want to deal with the constant aches and pains that seemed to come with every step forward. He wanted to feel stronger, not weaker. He grabbed his phone and sent Josh another text, "Back's killing me today. Is this normal?" Josh's reply came a few minutes later, "Dad, you've been making progress, but don't forget, recovery is key." You can't just push yourself every day. Maybe take it easy today and focus on stretching or mobility work instead of the full workout. Frank sighed. His son was right. He'd been so focused on the daily workouts that he hadn't given enough thought to recovery. After all, age wasn't the only factor that played a role in how his body healed. Rest and recuperation were just as crucial as effort. Maybe Frank had been too eager. Maybe he had been pushing too hard, too fast. He had started to believe that he could beat the clock, that somehow, if he worked hard enough, he could reverse the years of wear and tear on his body. But now, facing this painful reality, Frank realized that true transformation wasn't about forcing the body into submission. It was about understanding it, listening to it, and working with it. As the day went on, Frank decided to listen to his body. He took a long walk outside, moving slowly and purposefully. The cool air seemed to help clear his mind, and the steady rhythm of his footsteps calmed his racing thoughts. While walking, he remembered something else that had stuck with him from his research: the importance of balance in fitness, particularly for seniors. It wasn't just about strength, it was about integrating cardiovascular work, flexibility, and balance training. That was how people aged gracefully, by focusing on the entire spectrum of fitness, not just one narrow aspect. That night, instead of his usual bodyweight workout, Frank opted for a long stretching session. He worked through each of his major muscle groups, focusing on deep, controlled breathing and gentle stretches. His back still felt tight, but after a while, he felt a slight release of tension, a small improvement. By the time he was finished, he felt a calmness that hadn't been there earlier in the day. It wasn't much, but it was something. And sometimes, that was enough. The next morning, Frank woke up and immediately noticed that his back wasn't as sore. It was still a little stiff, but it was manageable. He decided to take it slow again, sticking with mobility exercises and stretching. "I'll get there," he said, gritting his teeth. "It's just going to take time." By the end of the week, Frank had incorporated rest days into his routine. Instead of focusing solely on bodyweight exercises, he gave equal importance to stretching, yoga, and balance work. His new regimen was more balanced, and though progress was slower than before, it felt sustainable. He had learned a valuable lesson: it wasn't just about pushing through the pain. It was about listening to his body and giving it what it needed: rest, recovery, and care. But then, a breakthrough came. After a particularly challenging workout, Frank stood in front of the mirror, looking at his reflection. He had come so far in such a short amount of time. Sure, he wasn't going to win any bodybuilding competitions anytime soon, but he was noticing real, tangible results. His arms were firmer, his chest stronger, and his legs, well, they had far more endurance than he remembered. But most of all, Frank had found a renewed sense of purpose. The weight he had been carrying, emotionally, mentally, and physically, was slowly lifting. He didn't have to become a gym rat to feel good about himself. He just had to keep doing what he was doing, being consistent, patient, and kind to his body. One evening, while sitting down with his wife, Linda, Frank found himself talking more openly about the challenges he had faced in the past few weeks. Linda, who had been quietly supportive, listened with understanding. "I think you've come a long way," Linda said with a warm smile. "You've learned to take care of yourself, not just push yourself. That's a big step." Frank nodded. "It's not just about building muscle anymore, Linda. It's about living life in a way that feels right. I've spent so many years pushing myself to the limit in work, but now, I'm learning that strength also means knowing when to rest." "Exactly," she said. "And it's never too late to start." For the first time in months, Frank felt like he was finally starting to get it. He was finding balance, not just in his workouts, but in his life. And with that balance, he could feel himself growing stronger, both inside and out. The morning light filtered softly through the curtains as Frank woke up feeling surprisingly refreshed. His back, though still carrying the weight of years, felt less stiff than it had in a long time. He stretched carefully, focusing on breathing deep and slow. A few months ago, he would have thought twice about starting his day with a series of stretches instead of a full-on workout. Back then, it would have felt like weakness, like he was admitting defeat. But now, as Frank went through his morning routine, simple stretches, mobility exercises, and slow movements, he realized how much he had shifted. He no longer viewed the slower pace as a sign of weakness. He was finding strength in patience. The truth was, Frank had always been a driven person. From the time he was young, he prided himself on being able to push through challenges. Whether it was working late into the night solving engineering problems or handling the complexities of family life, Frank had always thrived on resilience. But now, as he moved through his fitness journey, he found that resilience wasn't just about pushing yourself to the limit. It was about knowing when to slow down, when to take a step back, and when to listen to your body. After his morning routine, Frank made himself a cup of coffee and sat down at the kitchen table, his thoughts racing. It had been 6 months since he'd started his new fitness journey. 6 months of trial and error, of pushing through obstacles and learning lessons the hard way. He picked up his phone and scrolled through some old photos of himself, taken during the early days of his journey. The change was subtle, but it was there. His posture was better, his face a little less tired, his shoulders less hunched. And then there were the muscles, his arms were more defined, and even his legs had a certain strength to them that hadn't been there before. But it wasn't just about the physical transformation. It was about what he had learned along the way. Frank thought back to the early days when he first started working out again. The soreness, the frustration, the fear that his body wouldn't be able to handle the strain. He remembered feeling embarrassed when he couldn't do something that younger people took for granted, like lifting his own body weight or climbing stairs without feeling winded. And the times he felt like giving up, convinced that his body was just too old to handle the demands of fitness. But those feelings had faded over time. He had learned to push through, yes, but in a different way. Rather than forcing himself to do more, he had learned to focus on doing what his body needed. He'd learned the value of rest, recovery, and stretching, which had allowed his muscles to grow and strengthen at a sustainable pace. "I'm not the man I used to be," Frank mused aloud, taking a sip of his coffee. "And that's okay. Because the man I'm becoming is stronger, healthier, and more at peace with himself than ever before." But even as he acknowledged his progress, Frank couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to be done. He wasn't finished yet. Not by a long shot. A few days later, while scrolling through his phone, Frank saw an ad for a local senior fitness competition. It was for people over 60, focusing on strength and endurance in a supportive environment. The idea of competing was both exciting and intimidating. Was he really ready for something like that? He thought about it for a moment. Competing wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It wasn't about trying to show the world that he could still keep up with the younger generation. No, competing, Frank realized, could be a new way to challenge himself, to see just how far he had come, and how much further he could go. His first instinct was to hesitate, to think of all the reasons why he wasn't ready for it. But then he stopped himself. No, he thought. Why not me? Why not now? That night, he called Linda into the living room. She looked up from her book, her eyes curious. "I'm thinking about signing up for a senior fitness competition," Frank said, his voice steady but with a spark of excitement. Linda raised an eyebrow, a smile forming on her lips. "Really? You, the guy who hated the gym when we were younger?" Frank chuckled. "I know. But this isn't about the gym. It's about pushing myself a little further, seeing how strong I've become." Linda sat beside him, taking his hand in hers. "You've come such a long way, Frank. I think you can do it if you want to. You've earned it." Her support meant the world to him. But as much as he appreciated Linda's encouragement, he knew this wasn't about her. This was about him and his journey. "I've always been one for challenges," Frank said thoughtfully. "I spent my whole career taking on big projects, and I never back down from a challenge. Maybe it's time I apply that same mentality to myself. With that, Frank signed up for the competition. It wasn't about winning, it was about testing his limits, about seeing just how far he had come. In the weeks leading up to the event, Frank fine-tuned his routine, paying special attention to his strength training, but also keeping his focus on flexibility and balance. His mobility exercises remained a cornerstone of his regimen, and he continued to emphasize recovery. But now, he was working towards something concrete, something he could look forward to, a goal that would keep him motivated through the inevitable setbacks. The day of the competition arrived, and Frank felt a mixture of excitement and nerves. It wasn't the outcome that mattered, it was the journey that had led him here. He stood at the starting line, surrounded by other seniors who were all eager to prove themselves, just like him. Some of them were older, some of them had more visible muscle, but none of that mattered to Frank. He was here because he had transformed, not just his body, but his perspective. He wasn't competing against anyone except himself. With a deep breath, Frank stepped forward, ready to take on whatever challenges lay ahead. He knew the road wouldn't always be easy, but one thing was for sure, he wasn't going to stop. And for the first time in a long time, Frank realized that no matter what happened today, he had already won. The day of the senior fitness competition arrived faster than Frank had anticipated. He woke up early, feeling a mix of excitement and nervous energy. It was still dark outside when he made his way into the kitchen, grabbing a quick breakfast of oatmeal and fresh fruit. The familiar buzz of anticipation ran through his veins as he thought about the event ahead. Frank had spent weeks preparing for this day, but the morning of the competition felt different. It wasn't about the perfect form or hitting new personal bests. It was about pushing through the nerves and simply showing up, doing his best. This was the culmination of months of hard work and dedication, and he was ready, even if the nerves still clung to his thoughts. Linda was up early too, as always. She had been supportive through every moment of his fitness journey. As Frank sipped his coffee, Linda joined him at the table, her eyes twinkling with excitement. "You nervous?" she asked, a knowing smile on her face. "Not nervous, just focused," Frank replied, standing and adjusting his workout gear. He was wearing the same shirt he had worn on his first day of training, a simple, faded blue t-shirt that had become a symbol of his commitment. The shirt was now stretched and a little tighter than before, a reminder of how far he had come. Linda chuckled softly. "I think you've got this. You've put in the work, and you've already come so far." Frank smiled back at her, squeezing her hand. "Thanks, Linda. This means more to me than you know." Soon, they were on their way to the competition, the familiar feeling of nervous energy still buzzing beneath his skin. The venue was a large community center, buzzing with activity as participants gathered, each one of them with their own unique story and motivation. Frank was surprised by the diversity of the group, men and women of all ages and abilities, all there for the same reason, to challenge themselves, to see what they could accomplish. The first event of the competition was a timed circuit that included bodyweight exercises like squats, push-ups, and lunges. Frank stood in line with the other participants, his heart racing, but he reminded himself to breathe. He wasn't there to be the best, he was there to do his best. When his turn finally came, Frank stepped up to the starting line, his mind calm and focused. As the timer began, he moved through the exercises with a steady pace, making sure to maintain form over speed. His squats were deeper than they had been months ago, his push-ups stronger, and his lunges more controlled. The familiar burn in his muscles was there, but instead of panic or frustration, he felt a sense of pride. With each movement, Frank felt like he was rewriting the story of his life. A man who had once been intimidated by the idea of fitness now found himself standing tall, confidently completing each movement with precision. The timer went off, and he finished the circuit, his chest heaving with exertion, but a smile spread across his face. The crowd clapped and cheered, some people shouting words of encouragement. It wasn't the competition itself that had made him feel victorious, it was the simple fact that he had finished, that he had shown up and pushed through the challenge. The next event was a balance test, followed by a flexibility routine. As Frank stood on one foot and held his balance, he couldn't help but think back to how much progress he had made with his stability exercises. The stiffness in his legs had dissipated, replaced by a newfound ability to balance with ease. The flexibility routine, a series of stretches that tested his range of motion, was another area where Frank had seen huge improvements. In the beginning, his body had been stiff and resistant to movement, but now he could bend deeper, stretch farther, and hold positions he never thought possible. Each event was a reminder of how far he had come, but also a testament to the resilience that had grown inside him. The fact that he was here, competing at his age, was a victory in itself. At the end of the day, after all the events had concluded, Frank found himself surrounded by fellow competitors, chatting and sharing their experiences. There was a genuine camaraderie among the group, a shared understanding that the goal wasn't about winning a trophy, it was about something much deeper. It was about testing your limits, showing up for yourself, and realizing that age was just a number. As the results were announced, Frank didn't win first place, but he didn't care. He had achieved something far more important, he had proven to himself that he was stronger than he had ever imagined. And that, in the end, was worth more than any medal. Linda was waiting for him in the crowd, and when Frank saw her, he couldn't help but grin. "You did great," she said, pulling him into a tight hug. "I'm so proud of you." Frank hugged her back, feeling a rush of gratitude. "Thank you for sticking with me through all of this." As they walked out of the venue together, Frank reflected on the day. He wasn't just walking out with a sense of accomplishment, he was walking out with a deeper understanding of his own strength and resilience. This journey wasn't about beating the clock or outrunning his peers. It was about embracing the process, about finding strength in the struggle, and about continuing to grow, no matter the age or circumstance. The competition had been the test, but the journey was far from over. Frank had already come so far, and he knew that this was just the beginning. The competition was over, but Frank's mind was still racing. As he lay in bed that night, his body sore but satisfied, he couldn't help but replay every moment in his head. He had pushed himself harder than he ever thought possible. Every muscle had been challenged, and he had come out stronger for it. But more than the physical results, there was something deeper at play. Frank had come to realize that this journey wasn't just about gaining muscle or losing weight. It was about finding strength in the process, about redefining what was possible, not just in the gym, but in every aspect of his life. The next morning, as Frank stretched out on the yoga mat, feeling the slight soreness in his legs from the competition, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the cusp of something even greater. He had always been an achiever, someone who set goals and worked tirelessly to reach them. But now, for the first time in years, he wasn't just focused on the end goal. He was focused on the journey itself. He wasn't chasing perfection, he was chasing growth. Frank had come to understand that fitness wasn't just about lifting weights or running faster, it was about strengthening his body, his mind, and his spirit. His approach had evolved from, "How much can I do?" to, "How can I keep improving, no matter my age?" And that shift in mindset had transformed his entire outlook on life. Linda noticed the change in Frank almost immediately. Over breakfast the morning after the competition, she remarked, "You seem different, more relaxed, more content. I can tell that competition really meant something to you." Frank smiled, setting down his cup of coffee. It wasn't just the competition itself. It was everything that led up to it. The progress, the setbacks, the lessons. "I've learned that the journey is just as important as the destination, if not more." Linda nodded thoughtfully. "I've watched you grow, Frank. It's like you found a new kind of strength, one that's more than just physical." He looked at her, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. "I think you're right. It's not just about lifting weights or doing push-ups anymore. It's about taking care of myself, mind, body, and soul. I've been focused on my body for so long that I forgot how important it is to take care of my mind and emotions, too." The truth was, Frank had been so caught up in the physical aspect of fitness that he had overlooked the mental and emotional components. His entire life, he had been driven by the need to achieve. But this experience, especially the competition, had shown him that the true key to strength lay in balance, in finding a way to nurture his entire self. As Frank moved through his workouts in the days following the competition, he began to focus more on his mental well-being. He incorporated mindfulness into his routine, taking moments to breathe deeply and focus on the present. Meditation became a regular part of his day, helping him clear his mind and reframe negative thoughts. He also made more time for the things that brought him joy outside of exercise, spending time with Linda, reconnecting with old friends, and even picking up a new hobby in photography, something he'd always wanted to try but never found the time for. One afternoon, as Frank sat in the park, camera in hand, capturing the beauty of the landscape, he found himself reflecting on how far he'd come. It wasn't just his muscles that had transformed, his entire approach to life had shifted. He wasn't the same person he had been just a year ago, he was stronger, not just physically, but emotionally and mentally as well. It was then that Frank had an epiphany. The Elon Musk approach that he had adopted at the beginning of his fitness journey had served him well. It had pushed him to take a different perspective on aging and health, one that emphasized innovation and personal growth. But as much as he appreciated that approach, he now realized that it wasn't just about using technology or new methods to improve his body. It was about using the right mindset, one of continuous improvement, patience, and self-care. He had become a firm believer in the idea that fitness wasn't just about more, faster, stronger. It was about listening to your body, respecting your limits, and then finding ways to gradually push those limits further, mindfully, thoughtfully, and without rushing the process. Frank had realized that this journey wasn't just about building muscle or competing in events. It was about building a new way of living, one where he could age gracefully, stay strong, and continue growing as a person, both physically and mentally, well into his later years. Later that evening, Frank sat with Linda on the porch, enjoying the cool breeze of the late summer air. The sun was just setting, casting a golden glow over the horizon. They watched as the world around them slowly faded into twilight. "I've been thinking about what you said," Frank told Linda, his voice calm and content. "This journey isn't just about what I can do with my body. It's about finding balance. About taking care of every part of me." Linda smiled, her eyes soft with affection. "I think that's exactly it, Frank. You've learned that strength is so much more than physical power. It's about how you treat yourself, your mind, your emotions, and the people around you." Frank nodded. "I couldn't have said it better myself. I want to continue growing, not just physically, but in every way possible. And I want to make sure that I keep moving forward with the right mindset." Linda squeezed his hand. "I think you're on the right path." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Frank felt a sense of peace that he hadn't known in years. He was on a new path, one where fitness wasn't a destination, but a lifelong journey. And for the first time in a long time, he felt truly alive, knowing that every step he took was a step toward becoming the best version of himself. A few weeks had passed since the competition, and life had returned to its usual rhythm. Frank had settled into a routine, waking up early to meditate, working out in the mornings, and spending time with Linda in the afternoons. It felt good, almost too good. But deep down, Frank knew that a real test was coming. Life, after all, wasn't always smooth sailing. One morning, as Frank was going through his workout, something felt off. His knees, which had been holding up well during his new fitness routine, began to feel a little stiff. The nagging pain that had once been an obstacle in his younger days started to creep back. Frank didn't think much of it at first. He pushed through the discomfort, focusing on his form, but as the day went on, the pain only grew worse. By afternoon, Frank could hardly walk without wincing. Linda noticed immediately when he came home. "Frank, what happened? You're limping," she said, concern spreading across her face. "It's nothing," Frank shrugged, trying to downplay it. Just some old aches coming back. I'll be fine. But Linda didn't buy it. You've been working so hard. Maybe you should take it easy for a bit. Frank hesitated, a familiar resistance bubbling up inside him. He was used to pushing through discomfort. He had always prided himself on his ability to power through challenges, both physical and emotional. But deep down, he knew Linda was right. Perhaps this was the universe's way of reminding him that resilience wasn't just about pushing through pain, it was about listening to your body and knowing when to take a step back. That evening, Frank made an appointment with his doctor. After a thorough examination and a few tests, the doctor confirmed what Frank had feared: the wear and tear from years of being physically active had finally caught up with him. He had some mild arthritis in his knees. The news hit Frank harder than he had expected. For so long, he had felt invincible. The workouts, the competitions, the constant progress, it all gave him a sense of power and control. But now, it seemed like the one thing he had relied on, his physical strength, was beginning to betray him. How long will I have to stop? Frank asked, a knot of worry forming in his stomach. The doctor smiled reassuringly. It's not about stopping altogether. It's about adapting. We'll focus on strengthening the muscles around your knees, and we'll adjust your routine to minimize the impact. But this doesn't mean you can't keep moving forward. It just means you'll need to be smarter about it. Frank left the doctor's office feeling a mix of relief and frustration. He didn't want to accept that he needed to change his approach. But deep down, he knew that this was a turning point in his journey. He could choose to fight the inevitable, or he could adapt and continue growing, even if it meant doing things differently. That night, as he sat with Linda, he shared his concerns. I don't know what to do, Frank confessed, rubbing his forehead. I've worked so hard to get where I am, and now I feel like it's all slipping away. What if this is the end of my fitness journey? Linda took his hand gently. Frank, this isn't the end. It's just a new chapter. The journey you've been on hasn't been just about your body. It's been about learning how to adapt and keep going, no matter what life throws at you. You're not defined by your physical strength. You're defined by your ability to keep moving forward, even when things aren't perfect. Frank looked at her, her words sinking in. He had always defined his worth by his physical achievements, but now, he realized that true resilience wasn't about pushing through pain or achieving the perfect body, it was about being flexible, about embracing the setbacks, and finding a way to move forward anyway. The next few weeks were a test of patience and adaptability for Frank. He had to adjust his workout routine, switching to lower-impact exercises like swimming, cycling, and yoga. He also focused more on flexibility and mobility work, ensuring that his body stayed in motion without putting too much strain on his knees. At first, the change was difficult. Frank missed the intensity of his usual workouts, the feeling of lifting weights and challenging his limits. But over time, he came to appreciate the new routines. He found joy in swimming, in the fluid movements of yoga, and in the meditative qualities of each workout. His body felt lighter, more agile, and the nagging pain in his knees gradually began to subside. But the real transformation wasn't physical, it was mental. As he adapted to the new way of training, Frank realized that the lessons he had learned in the gym applied to life itself. Resilience wasn't about refusing to acknowledge limitations, it was about accepting them, adapting to them, and continuing to move forward. Life would never be perfect, and neither would his body. But the key to happiness and fulfillment was finding balance, being patient, and focusing on what he could control. One day, while swimming laps in the local pool, Frank had a breakthrough. He was moving through the water effortlessly, his muscles working in harmony, his mind calm and focused. He realized that this was the kind of strength he had been looking for all along, not the brute force of a young man, but the quiet strength of someone who had learned to listen to his body and mind. It was then that Frank understood, the true test of resilience wasn't in how hard you could push yourself, but in how gracefully you could adapt to the challenges that life threw your way. And in that moment, Frank made a promise to himself. He would continue to grow, to evolve, and to embrace every twist and turn of his journey, whether it was a victory or a setback. After all, resilience wasn't about avoiding failure. It was about learning to rise again, each time stronger than before. The sound of the waves crashing against the shore echoed in Frank's ears as he sat on a bench overlooking the beach. It was a crisp Saturday morning, and the early light reflected off the water, creating a golden glow that made everything seem calm and peaceful. But Frank was anything but calm. For the past few days, he had been feeling restless. His knee pain was manageable now, but something deeper was bothering him. It was as if all the progress he had made had hit a wall. He had adapted to his new workout routine, but there was an underlying frustration that had started to creep into his mind. It wasn't the pain, it was the feeling of being stuck. He'd always been someone who thrived on progress, who loved seeing visible results in his body. But now, with his knee issues and the changes in his routine, the progress wasn't as immediate or tangible as it had been before. It was hard for Frank to accept that sometimes growth wasn't about the numbers on a scale or the weights on a barbell. "I thought I'd feel more accomplished by now," Frank murmured to himself, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "But here I am, stuck." Linda had noticed his shift in mood too. She had been patient with him, but she could sense that something was off. When they sat down to dinner that evening, she asked him gently, "Frank, what's going on? You haven't seemed yourself lately." Frank sighed, setting down his fork. "I don't know. It's like I've hit a wall. I've been working so hard to adapt and stay consistent, but the results aren't coming as quickly as I expected. And I guess it's making me feel frustrated." Linda looked at him thoughtfully. "I get it. You've always been someone who pushes hard and expects big results. But maybe this is a moment to focus on something other than the outcome. Maybe it's time to focus on how you're feeling, on how you're thinking about the process." Frank frowned. "But isn't the point to improve, to get stronger, faster? To see the results of all that effort?" She nodded, but her tone was steady and kind. "Of course, those things are important. But sometimes, the results don't come in the way we expect, or on the timeline we want. That doesn't mean you're not improving. It means that maybe the kind of improvement you need right now isn't just physical. Maybe you need to shift your focus inward, to work on your mindset and your emotional strength." Frank leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed as he processed Linda's words. He had always focused so much on physical improvement, on achieving goals through sheer willpower, but Linda was right. Maybe he needed to give more attention to how he was feeling, not just about his workouts, but about himself. Over the next few days, Frank made a conscious effort to slow down and reflect on his mindset. He started meditating more regularly, taking the time to focus on his breath and quiet the noise in his mind. He also began journaling his thoughts, writing down the emotions he was feeling and identifying the negative patterns that had been holding him back. It wasn't easy. The first few days were filled with frustration as his mind raced, unable to quiet down. But as he stuck with it, Frank started to feel a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in a long time. One morning, after a particularly long meditation session, Frank had an epiphany. The frustration he had been feeling wasn't just about his fitness goals. It was a deeper feeling, one rooted in his desire for control. For years, Frank had used physical strength as a way to maintain control over his life. But now, with his body starting to show signs of age, that control was slipping. And that was okay. Frank smiled to himself, a sense of relief washing over him. He didn't have to control everything. He didn't need to force progress. Instead, he could embrace the process, trusting that the work he was doing, whether it was in the gym or in his mind, was moving him forward, even if the results weren't immediate. The next time Frank stepped into the gym, he carried this new mindset with him. He didn't focus on lifting heavier weights or pushing himself past his limits. Instead, he focused on the movement itself, the way his muscles engaged, the way his body felt with each repetition. It was less about the destination and more about the journey, less about pushing harder and more about being present. This shift in mindset began to change everything. Frank started to feel less frustrated with himself, less worried about perfecting every aspect of his routine. He learned to celebrate the small wins, the moments of clarity, the improved flexibility, the ability to enjoy his workouts without the pressure to constantly improve. As his mindset evolved, so did his physical results. Frank noticed that his knee pain was gradually improving, not because he was pushing harder, but because he had allowed himself to rest and focus on the recovery process. His body was responding in a way he hadn't anticipated. When he stopped fighting it and started listening to it, everything began to fall into place. One evening, after a particularly enjoyable yoga session, Frank shared his newfound perspective with Linda. "I think I've figured it out," Frank said, a grin spreading across his face. "It's not about forcing things or constantly pushing myself. It's about being kind to myself, about being present and patient. I've been focusing so much on the end result, but the real power is in the process. It's in the mindset." Linda looked at him with pride. "I knew you'd get there. You've always been capable of more than just physical strength, Frank. You've always had the strength to change, to grow, and to be present in the moment." Frank felt a deep sense of gratitude. For the first time in a long time, he understood that true strength wasn't just about physical power, it was about mental and emotional resilience, about the ability to adapt and evolve, and about finding peace in the journey itself. As he looked out the window at the setting sun, Frank realized that his journey was far from over. In fact, it had just begun. The road ahead would have its challenges, but now, he felt ready for them, not because he was stronger than ever, but because he had learned the most important lesson of all, that strength was a mindset. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Frank had always been the kind of man who set high standards for himself. From his early years as a young athlete to his more recent journey toward health and fitness, he'd pushed himself relentlessly, never allowing himself to fall short. It was a mindset that had served him well in many ways, but now, as he continued his journey of physical recovery and mental growth, he found himself facing a new challenge: the weight of other people's expectations. It wasn't just Linda who noticed it. Over the past few weeks, Frank had been getting calls from old friends, some of whom he hadn't spoken to in years. They had seen his social media posts about his workouts and his transformation, and they were all eager to reconnect. One evening, Frank sat down with his old college buddy, Dave, at a local coffee shop. Dave had always been the life of the party, the guy who loved to joke around and push boundaries. They hadn't talked much since Frank had settled down with Linda, and Frank was curious to see how much their friendship had changed. "Man, you look good," Dave said, eyeing Frank's leaner physique. "I saw your posts on Facebook. Looks like you're getting in the best shape of your life. I gotta say, I'm impressed. I knew you always had it in you." Frank smiled, but there was a sense of unease building up inside him. He had always enjoyed these kinds of compliments in the past, but now, it felt different. The praise seemed more like a pressure, as if people expected him to keep up some kind of image or persona. "Thanks, Dave. It's been a journey, for sure," Frank replied, trying to keep the conversation light. But Dave didn't let it go. "So, what's next, man? You're looking so good, but I'm sure you're not done yet, right? You've got to be hitting some serious PRs by now, huh? Let's see you show us that bold Frank we used to know. Come on, man, don't hold back." Frank's stomach tightened. The old Frank, his younger self, was the one who loved the competition, who pushed himself to the limit every day. The bold Frank was the guy who thrived on showing off his strength, whether it was in the gym or at a party. But that Frank had been driven by something deeper, by insecurity and a need for validation. "I don't really focus on that stuff anymore, Dave," Frank said, trying to redirect the conversation. "I've been more focused on feeling good, being healthy, and staying consistent with my workouts." Dave raised an eyebrow. "Feeling good? Come on, man, you're not telling me you don't miss the thrill of crushing those PRs and pushing yourself to the limit. You can't tell me you've gotten soft on me now. Frank felt a pang of discomfort. It was hard to explain to Dave, or anyone else, that his approach to fitness had changed. That the focus wasn't on pushing past his limits for the sake of validation anymore. It was about maintaining balance, taking care of his body, and finding joy in the process rather than the outcome. But in that moment, Frank realized that not everyone would understand that shift. As the conversation continued, Frank found himself feeling more and more disconnected from the expectations that others placed on him. Dave, along with many others in his circle, seemed to think that fitness was all about pushing boundaries and constantly improving. To them, Frank's journey seemed incomplete unless it culminated in a visible transformation, a bigger, stronger version of the man they had once known. When Frank left the coffee shop that evening, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was failing somehow. He had always cared about how others saw him, and now that he was changing his approach to fitness, it felt like he was letting them down. They expected him to be the strong, competitive guy they once knew, the guy who thrived on the pressure to perform. But Frank knew something they didn't. His journey was about more than physical appearance or external accolades. It was about self-acceptance, about overcoming the mental and emotional barriers that had held him back for so long. It was about finding peace in the process, not in the destination. The next few days were tough for Frank. He wrestled with his emotions, questioning his choices and whether he was doing the right thing. He couldn't stop thinking about the expectations that had been placed on him, and whether he was letting people down by not living up to them. His mind kept going back to the conversations he'd had, replaying every word, every moment of doubt that had crept in. Finally, after a long day of introspection, Frank sat down with Linda. He had to talk to someone who would understand. "I saw Dave the other day," Frank began, his voice heavy with frustration. "He was all hyped up about my progress, and he just kept asking about the next big thing. He wants to see me crush more PRs, do more, be more. It's like he doesn't even get it, Linda." Linda looked at him with soft, understanding eyes. "I know it's tough when people expect you to stay the same. But Frank, the truth is, you don't have to live up to anyone else's idea of success. This is your journey. You're not here to perform for anyone else." Frank exhaled deeply. "But it's hard. It's like they see me as this strong guy, and if I don't keep up that image, I'm failing somehow. I don't know how to tell them that I don't want to live like that anymore." Linda reached over, placing a hand on his. "You don't owe anyone an explanation, Frank. Your health, your growth, those are the things that matter. Not what they think you should be doing. You've been through a lot, and you've changed in ways they can't understand. But that's okay. You don't need to prove anything to anyone." Frank took a deep breath, feeling the weight slowly lift off his shoulders. Linda's words were a reminder he needed. He didn't have to live up to anyone else's standards but his own. And as he reflected on it, he realized that his transformation wasn't just physical, it was a shift in mindset. He no longer needed external validation to feel fulfilled. The next time Frank saw his friends, he would be firm in his new approach. He would embrace his growth, share his journey, and show them that true strength was about more than lifting weights, it was about lifting the burden of others' expectations and embracing the freedom to be himself. The morning sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting a soft glow across the living room. Frank had woken up early, as he often did now, to practice some yoga and meditation. His knee was feeling better than it had in years, and there was a renewed sense of peace that he'd found in his mornings, a quiet, reflective time before the world began to demand his attention. As he settled into a gentle stretch, his phone buzzed on the coffee table. Frank hesitated for a moment before reaching for it, wondering who it could be. He didn't have many friends who reached out early on a Saturday morning, but the name that appeared on the screen brought a smile to his face. It was Mike, his brother-in-law. "Hey Frank. You up for a game of basketball this afternoon?" the text read. "Linda mentioned you've been working out a lot." Let's see if you've still got it, old man. Frank chuckled to himself. Mike had always been the one to pull him into spontaneous activities, pushing him to join in things that involved competition and fun. But this was different. Frank had spent so much time focusing on his personal journey, his fitness routine, his mental growth, that the idea of jumping into a fast-paced game of basketball seemed daunting. It wasn't that he couldn't play, it was that he hadn't played in years. And as much as he'd improved physically, he still felt a sense of vulnerability when it came to competitive activities like this. But there was something about the invitation that made Frank pause. Basketball had been a huge part of his life growing up, and the thought of reconnecting with that part of himself, of enjoying a simple game without the pressure, sounded appealing. He knew, deep down, that this wasn't just about a game of basketball. It was about reconnecting with the people in his life, about sharing his growth with others in a way that felt authentic. Still, the old anxiety started creeping in. What if he wasn't good enough? What if he couldn't keep up with the others? Would they see him as weak, or worse, would he let them down? Taking a deep breath, Frank decided to reply. Sounds great, Mike. I'll be there. The decision wasn't just about basketball. It was about learning to embrace connection again, something he hadn't prioritized in a long time. Frank had been so focused on his personal growth, on doing things for himself, that he had isolated himself to a certain extent. He realized that relationships, whether with family, friends, or loved ones, were just as important for his well-being as his own personal journey. Later that afternoon, Frank found himself driving to the local basketball court, his heart pounding in his chest. The familiar feeling of nervous excitement rose in him as he pulled into the parking lot. It had been too long since he had played. But as he stepped out of his car, he saw Mike waiting by the court with a few other guys, a mix of old friends and family members. They waved him over, smiling and laughing, making him feel instantly welcome. Frank. You ready to show us what you've got? Mike called out with a grin. Frank smiled back, feeling the tension in his shoulders begin to loosen. It wasn't about winning or losing, it was about having fun, about being present, and about embracing the connection he'd been missing for so long. The game was everything Frank had hoped for. Sure, he wasn't running as fast or jumping as high as he used to, but the joy of moving his body again, of laughing with friends and family, outweighed any self-doubt. With every pass, every shot, and every cheer, Frank felt more connected, not just to the people around him, but to the person he was becoming. After a few rounds, they took a break, and Mike slapped Frank on the back. You've still got it, man, he said, laughing. I knew you couldn't stay away from the game for too long. Frank laughed too, feeling a sense of lightness he hadn't experienced in months. Maybe I'm not as fast as I used to be, but I'm definitely having more fun now. As the game continued, Frank found himself not focusing on how well he played but on the experience itself. He wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. He was simply enjoying the moment. The connection with his friends and family, the camaraderie, and the shared experience of play brought a new sense of joy that he hadn't realized he'd been missing. By the end of the game, everyone was exhausted but in high spirits. They all sat down on the sidelines, catching their breath and talking about everything from work to family to plans for the holidays. Frank felt a deep sense of gratitude as he listened to their stories and laughter. It wasn't just the physical activity that had rejuvenated him, it was the way this simple game had reminded him of the importance of connection. On the drive home, Frank reflected on the experience. He had always thought of strength as something that was deeply personal, something that came from within, from pushing yourself alone. But today, he realized that real strength came from the bonds we share with others, from the moments of vulnerability and laughter, and from the ability to embrace connection without the need for competition or approval. As he walked into the house, Linda greeted him with a warm hug. How was the game? She asked, her eyes sparkling. It was amazing, Frank said, a grin spreading across his face. I wasn't sure if I was ready for it, but I'm so glad I went. It felt good to just be part of something, you know. Not just focusing on myself but being with the people I care about. Linda smiled, holding him close. I'm so proud of you, Frank. You've come a long way. It's not just about how strong you are physically. It's about how strong you are with the people around you. And today, you showed that strength. Frank nodded, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't expected. The journey wasn't just about what he could do alone, it was about the connections he had with others, the way those relationships helped him grow. And in that moment, Frank knew that he was stronger than ever, not because he had done it alone, but because he had allowed others to be part of his journey. Frank had always been someone who prided himself on his ability to push through pain. For years, he had been determined to overcome physical limitations, constantly testing his body's endurance and strength. The intense workouts, the sweat, the soreness, it had all become part of his identity. But as Frank progressed in his recovery and transformation, he began to notice something that hadn't been on his radar before, the silent weight of mental fatigue. It started as a nagging feeling, something that crept up during his yoga sessions or after a particularly difficult workout. At first, he brushed it off, attributing it to the natural ups and downs of his fitness routine. But soon, it became harder to ignore. He began to feel drained, not from the physical effort, but from the constant pressure to be better, faster, stronger. It wasn't just the demands of his workouts anymore, it was the mental strain of always striving for perfection. The realization hit him one evening while he was sitting alone in the living room. Linda had gone out to dinner with a friend, and Frank found himself with a rare moment of solitude. He had just completed a grueling strength training session, and his muscles ached in a way that felt familiar but distant. As he sipped on a protein shake, his mind began to wander, and that familiar feeling of pressure crept in. Is this all worth it? Frank wondered to himself. The question wasn't about his physical transformation, it was about his emotional and mental state. He had worked so hard to build strength and resilience, but he realized that his mental health had taken a back seat. The relentless drive to improve, to constantly challenge himself, had left little room for rest, reflection, or even self-compassion. He thought about the people he admired, those who had found success not just through physical strength, but through a balanced, grounded mindset. It wasn't just about pushing through pain, it was about listening to your body and your mind, respecting their limits, and understanding that growth wasn't linear. He had been so focused on the physical aspect of his transformation that he had neglected the mental and emotional part of the process. The next day, Frank decided to take a different approach. Instead of going straight to his usual workout routine, he took a step back and reflected. He scheduled a session with a therapist that Linda had recommended, a professional who specialized in helping people navigate the mental and emotional aspects of physical transformation. Frank had never considered therapy as part of his wellness routine, but now, it felt like the right time to explore it. When he arrived at the therapist's office, he felt a mix of uncertainty and curiosity. It had been a long time since he had opened up about his thoughts and feelings in such a structured way. But as he sat down across from Dr. Jenkins, a calm and approachable woman in her late 40s, he felt a sense of relief. So, Frank, Dr. Jenkins began, tell me what brought you here today. Frank took a deep breath. I've been working on my health for a while now, physically, I mean. I've lost weight, I'm stronger than I've been in years, and I'm proud of how far I've come. But lately, I've been feeling overwhelmed. I think I've been pushing myself too hard, mentally as much as physically. I'm just exhausted. Dr. Jenkins nodded thoughtfully. It sounds like you've been focusing a lot on the doing, the physical workouts, the external results. But have you been giving yourself space for the being, the mental and emotional side of this journey? Frank frowned. I guess I've been so focused on progress and improvement that I haven't really thought about that. I just assumed that if I kept pushing, I'd eventually reach some point where everything feels right. But instead, I just feel worn out. That's very common, Dr. Jenkins said. When we focus too much on the external, we can sometimes lose sight of what's happening inside. You're pushing your body to its limits, but you're also pushing your mind, your emotions, and your spirit to their limits too. The truth is, mental and emotional health is just as important as physical health. You can't neglect one for the other. Frank sat back in his chair, letting her words sink in. He had always seen mental health as something secondary to physical health, something that other people dealt with. He had always believed that if he worked hard enough and built enough strength, everything else would fall into place. But now, it was clear to him that this was a misunderstanding. Strength wasn't just about muscle, it was about mental clarity, emotional resilience, and finding a sense of balance. Over the next few weeks, Frank made a commitment to focus on his mental and emotional health just as much as he had focused on his physical fitness. He began journaling every morning, writing down his thoughts and feelings without judgment. He made time for meditation, allowing himself moments of stillness and presence, even on the busiest days. And he prioritized his therapy sessions, using them as a tool to unpack his emotional baggage and release the pressure he had been carrying. Frank also started to notice the subtle shifts in his overall well-being. He was no longer plagued by the constant mental chatter that used to follow him through every workout. He felt more at ease with his progress, more confident in his choices. And most importantly, he started to embrace the idea that growth wasn't about perfection, it was about progress, understanding, and acceptance. One afternoon, as Frank sat on his porch, reflecting on how far he had come, Linda joined him with a cup of tea in hand. She sat beside him, resting her head on his shoulder. "How are you feeling today?" she asked softly. Frank smiled, feeling a deep sense of peace. "Better. I think I've finally realized that it's okay not to be perfect. I've been so focused on pushing myself that I forgot it's just as important to take care of my mind and emotions. It's a process, one step at a time." Linda squeezed his hand, her voice warm with pride. "I'm really proud of you, Frank. I can see the change in you, not just in your body, but in your heart and mind." Frank nodded. "It's a journey, isn't it? One that's not just about getting stronger physically, but about finding balance in everything, mind, body, and spirit. And I'm learning to be kind to myself along the way." As they sat together in the quiet of the afternoon, Frank realized that this new understanding, this deeper, more holistic approach to his health, was the key to his ongoing transformation. Strength wasn't just about what you could lift, it was about how you carried yourself, how you embraced every part of who you were, and how you nurtured the connection between your mind, body, and spirit. Frank's morning routine had been a ritual of peace and purpose for months. Every day, he woke up at 6 a.m., did yoga, meditated for 15 minutes, and then hit the gym for a workout that pushed his limits. It had become the foundation of his days, and he had felt stronger than ever. Not just physically, but mentally. He was in control, at least, that's what he told himself. But one morning, everything changed. As he went to execute a simple leg press, Frank felt something in his knee give way. It wasn't an excruciating pain, but there was an unmistakable sensation, a snap, followed by a dull ache that spread throughout his leg. Frank stopped immediately, his heart racing. He had been cautious, careful with his form, and yet here it was, a setback. He limped out of the gym, gritting his teeth. The ache was still there, and he couldn't shake the feeling of disappointment that washed over him. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had worked so hard to get to this point, and now, it felt like everything was slipping through his fingers. By the time he reached home, Linda could see the concern in his eyes. "What happened?" she asked, her voice gentle. "I think I've injured my knee," Frank replied, his tone flat. "It's not too bad, but I can feel it. I'm worried it might set me back a lot." Linda put down her coffee and walked over to him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Hey, it's okay. Don't panic. We'll take it slow, figure it out." Frank nodded, but the anxiety continued to gnaw at him. The injury felt like a huge obstacle. He had worked so hard to get where he was, had pushed through so much pain and so many doubts, and now, this. It seemed like a cruel twist of fate. The next few days were a blur of doctor's appointments, rest, and a lot of frustration. The diagnosis was not as severe as he feared, but the recommendation was clear: rest for a few weeks, and no intense physical activity. Frank was told that the injury wasn't a long-term problem, but he needed to give his knee time to heal. As he sat on the couch that evening, his leg propped up, Frank felt a deep sense of frustration. He had been so focused on his physical progress, so determined to keep moving forward, and now, he was stuck. The journey he had been on, one of improvement, strength, and resilience, had suddenly hit a wall. For the first time in months, Frank found himself questioning his path. Had all the work been for nothing? Was he doomed to be sidelined again, stuck in a cycle of injury and recovery? The familiar voice of self-doubt crept in, whispering that perhaps he wasn't cut out for this after all. But then, in the silence of his thoughts, something shifted. Frank realized that this was part of the process. His journey hadn't been about always moving forward without obstacles. It had been about learning to handle setbacks, how to fall and rise again. This injury wasn't the end of his journey, it was just a temporary roadblock, one that he could overcome if he approached it with patience and resilience. The following week, Frank started focusing on the things he could do instead of what he couldn't. He couldn't run, squat, or lift heavy weights, but there were other ways to stay active and engaged with his body. He turned to upper body workouts, gentle stretching, and mobility exercises for his knee. He spent time meditating and practicing mindfulness, letting go of the frustration and accepting the injury as part of his story. During this time, Frank found solace in his therapy sessions. He shared his feelings of disappointment and the fear that he would lose all the progress he had made. Dr. Jenkins listened carefully, then helped him reframe his thinking. "Frank, this is a setback, not a failure," she said. "It's important to understand that recovery is also part of your journey. It's not about perfection, it's about learning to adapt, to be resilient, and to find new ways to grow, even when life doesn't go as planned." Her words resonated deeply with him. Frank began to see the injury not as a sign of weakness, but as an opportunity for growth in a new direction. He had learned so much about physical strength, but this was a lesson in mental strength. It was about being kind to himself when things weren't going according to plan, and about trusting that the journey was still unfolding, even if it wasn't in the way he had imagined. As the weeks passed, Frank's knee began to heal. He continued with his workouts, but now, he focused more on mobility and mindfulness than pushing through pain. He incorporated exercises that helped strengthen the muscles around his knee, and while he still wasn't able to return to his full routine, he felt a new sense of peace about the process. One afternoon, as he was finishing a light workout, Mike called. Frank picked up the phone, and Mike's voice boomed through the speaker. "Hey man, how's the knee? You ready to get back into the game?" Frank smiled, feeling a warmth in his chest. "It's getting better. Slowly, but I'm learning to take it one step at a time. It's frustrating, but I'm starting to realize that I don't have to rush." Mike paused for a moment, then said, "You know, it's not always about how fast we get there. Sometimes, it's the journey that shapes us the most. I think you've already come farther than you realize." Frank thought about Mike's words as he ended the call. He had always been so focused on getting to the finish line, on achieving his goals as quickly as possible. But now, he understood that the setbacks were just as important as the victories. They were the moments that built resilience, that helped him become stronger in ways he hadn't expected. That evening, as he sat on the couch with Linda, Frank reflected on everything he had learned. The injury had been difficult, but it had also been an opportunity. It had forced him to slow down, to listen to his body, and to find new ways to be strong. And most importantly, it had reminded him that setbacks weren't the end of the journey, they were part of it. Every challenge, every obstacle, was an opportunity to grow. As Linda leaned against him, he squeezed her hand, feeling a sense of gratitude for the lessons he was learning. "I think I finally get it," Frank said softly. "It's not about always moving forward. It's about how we handle the times we fall." Linda smiled and kissed his cheek. Exactly. It's about persistence. And you've got plenty of that. Frank smiled back, knowing that this setback was just another chapter in his ongoing story. A chapter where he had learned that resilience wasn't about never falling, but about always rising. Frank woke up earlier than usual that morning, the soft light of dawn spilling through the window. His knee was still recovering, but the pain had decreased significantly. His progress was slow, but steady. And for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of acceptance. He had learned that sometimes, moving forward meant stepping back and giving himself the time and space to heal, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally as well. As he walked down to the kitchen, Frank's thoughts began to drift toward the future. He had become accustomed to the feeling of challenge, of pushing his body to its limits. But after the injury, he had come to realize something important. True strength wasn't just about how much weight you could lift or how fast you could run. It was about the strength to accept where you were in the moment and be patient with the process. Linda was already sitting at the table, sipping her tea. She looked up when Frank entered, a warm smile spreading across her face. "How's the knee today?" she asked, her voice soft and caring. "Better," Frank said, sitting down next to her. "It's getting there. I'm starting to get used to this slower pace, actually." Linda raised an eyebrow. "Really? I thought you'd be going stir-crazy by now." Frank chuckled, shaking his head. "You know, I used to think that the only way forward was full speed ahead, no matter what. But this injury has taught me that sometimes the best way to move forward is to take a step back and just breathe." Linda nodded in understanding. "I'm proud of you for seeing that. You've always been someone who goes after things with such determination. But it's nice to see you accepting that it's okay to slow down." Frank smiled, appreciating her support. "It's not easy, though. The hardest part is learning how to trust that taking my time won't make me weaker. It's like I've been learning patience all over again." That day, Frank decided to spend the afternoon at the park, walking at a slow pace around the perimeter. It was one of those rare moments where he wasn't rushing to achieve anything. He wasn't trying to set a record or break any personal bests. He was simply moving, letting his body dictate the pace. And for the first time in months, he felt at peace with the process. As he walked, Frank's mind wandered to the many lessons he had learned over the past few months. His transformation had not been linear. There had been setbacks, doubts, moments of frustration. But with each challenge, he had grown, not just physically, but emotionally and mentally as well. He had learned that true strength came from embracing the highs and the lows, from being resilient enough to handle whatever came his way. Later that evening, Frank sat down to reflect in his journal, a practice that had become an important part of his daily routine. He had written many entries over the past few months, but tonight's felt different. There was a calmness to his words, a sense of clarity. "Today, I learned that patience is not just something we practice when we're forced to. It's something we can choose to cultivate, even when everything around us is telling us to rush. This journey is about more than just physical strength. It's about embracing the slower moments, the moments when we're not moving forward, but we're still growing." As he closed the journal, Frank felt a deep sense of gratitude. He had come to realize that the injury was not just a setback, it was a gift. It had forced him to slow down, to reflect, and to embrace a different kind of strength, the strength that comes from knowing when to pause and when to rest. Over the next few weeks, Frank continued to ease back into his workouts. He wasn't trying to push himself to the same extremes as before. Instead, he focused on listening to his body and giving it the time it needed to fully recover. And with each day, he noticed something remarkable. The more he practiced patience, the stronger he became, not just in his knee, but in his mind. He started incorporating more mindful practices into his routine. Each workout became a meditation, a chance to focus on his breath, his movement, and his thoughts. He learned to appreciate the process, not just the outcome. He learned that it wasn't always about achieving the next goal, but about being present in each moment, embracing the journey as it unfolded. One evening, as Frank sat on the porch with Linda, he shared his latest thoughts with her. "I've been thinking a lot about the past few months," he said, gazing out at the horizon. "The injury was hard, but in a way, it's been a blessing. It forced me to slow down, to really pay attention to where I am and where I've been. I used to be so focused on what was next that I didn't fully appreciate what I had right in front of me." Linda nodded, resting her head on his shoulder. "I think that's one of the most important things you've learned. Sometimes, we get so caught up in the destination that we forget to enjoy the journey." Frank smiled, feeling a sense of peace wash over him. "Yeah. I'm finally learning that it's okay to take my time. The journey doesn't have to be a race." And for the first time in a long while, Frank felt that he was exactly where he was supposed to be, on his journey, moving forward at his own pace, with patience, resilience, and an open heart. Frank had always prided himself on his relentless drive. Whether it was pushing through pain during a workout or staying up late to complete a project, he was accustomed to putting his all into everything he did. It had been this determination that had carried him through so many challenges in his life. But as he spent more time reflecting on his journey, something began to shift. It was early morning again when Frank found himself standing in front of the mirror. He had spent the last few weeks following a carefully structured routine. His knee was almost healed, but there was still some residual tightness that made him cautious. He had learned how to balance his workouts, incorporating low-impact exercises and focusing on strengthening his body in ways that didn't put too much strain on his knee. But as he looked at his reflection, he realized that his mental state was still a bit unbalanced. Despite the improvements in his physical health, he still felt a nagging restlessness. It was the same feeling he had always had, the compulsion to keep moving, to keep improving, to keep pushing, as though anything less would mean failure. Linda walked into the room and stopped when she saw the look on his face. "You okay?" she asked, her voice soft but knowing. Frank sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just thinking. I've been working so hard to get back into shape, but I'm starting to wonder if I'm pushing myself too much. I'm scared of losing momentum again." Linda stepped closer and placed a hand on his arm. "You've been through a lot, Frank. It's okay to take it slow. You don't have to keep pushing yourself constantly." Frank shook his head. "I know, but it feels like if I don't keep pushing, I'm going to lose everything I've worked for. What if I get too comfortable and stop growing?" Linda smiled gently, understanding his internal struggle. Growth doesn't always come from pushing harder. Sometimes, growth happens when we give ourselves space to rest and recover. Maybe it's time to learn a new kind of strength, the strength to know when to pause. Her words resonated deeply with Frank. He had been so focused on progress that he had forgotten the importance of balance. For so long, he had defined strength by how hard he could push through obstacles, how much pain he could endure, how many reps he could complete. But now, he was beginning to see that true strength also came from the ability to step back, listen to his body, and honor his need for recovery. Over the next few days, Frank made a conscious effort to reevaluate his routine. He started incorporating more rest days into his schedule, acknowledging that his body needed time to heal, not just physically, but mentally as well. It was a difficult shift for him, as he had always seen rest as a sign of weakness. But the more he practiced this new approach, the more he realized that rest wasn't about giving up, it was about replenishing the energy needed to keep moving forward. One evening, after a long, reflective walk through the park, Frank sat down with Linda and shared his thoughts. "I've been thinking a lot about balance lately," he began. "I've always been the kind of person who believes in pushing through every obstacle, never slowing down. But I'm starting to understand that growth doesn't come from just constant movement. It comes from knowing when to push and when to rest." Linda nodded. "Exactly. It's all about balance. We can't pour from an empty cup. If we don't take time to rest and recharge, eventually, we won't have anything left to give." Frank smiled, feeling a deep sense of peace in that moment. "I'm starting to get it. Strength isn't just about endurance. It's about understanding what we need, whether it's a break, a moment of stillness, or the courage to slow down. As the days went by, Frank's approach to his workouts began to change. He no longer saw rest days as a waste of time or a sign of weakness. Instead, he viewed them as essential parts of his journey, crucial to his recovery and growth. He learned that rest didn't make him less strong, it made him stronger, because it allowed his body and mind to recharge, to rebuild, and to prepare for the next challenge. In his quieter moments, Frank began to meditate more frequently, focusing on the power of stillness and the wisdom that could be found in slowing down. He began to notice things he had previously overlooked, the sound of his breath, the way his muscles stretched and released, the quiet strength of his own mind. One afternoon, after a particularly restorative yoga session, Frank sat down on the floor, taking a deep breath as he reflected on how far he had come. His knee still wasn't 100%, but it was getting stronger each day. And more importantly, his mind was beginning to find peace in the process. He realized that the journey to strength wasn't just about the physical changes he had made. It was about the mental and emotional shifts he had experienced. He had learned how to embrace patience, how to face setbacks with resilience, and now, he was learning how to strike the balance between pushing himself and giving himself the care he needed. Frank wasn't sure what the future held. But for the first time in a long while, he felt confident that he was moving in the right direction. He had discovered a deeper, more sustainable approach to strength, one that valued both effort and rest, action and stillness, progress and patience. And with that realization, Frank knew that his journey was far from over. It was just evolving, deepening, and expanding in ways he never could have imagined when he first set out on this path. It had been several weeks since Frank had started embracing the idea of balance, slowing down, and listening to his body. The knee pain had almost entirely faded, and he was able to push himself in his workouts again, though with more mindfulness than before. Yet, despite all the progress, there was something lingering deep inside him, a quiet voice that questioned whether he was doing enough. That voice had been a constant companion for most of his life, telling him that he wasn't working hard enough, wasn't achieving fast enough. Frank couldn't shake the feeling that there was still something more he had to do to prove himself, not just to others, but to himself. One morning, as Frank was preparing his breakfast, the voice inside his head became louder. "You're getting soft. You could be pushing harder. Are you really committed to your goal, or are you just taking the easy route?" It wasn't the first time he had heard that voice. In fact, it had been a regular part of his inner monologue for years. It was the voice that pushed him to go the extra mile, to stay up an hour longer, to train until his muscles burned and ached. But now, he wasn't sure if it was pushing him toward greatness or leading him down a dangerous path of self-doubt and burnout. Sitting at the kitchen table, he tried to push the voice out of his mind, but it kept creeping back in. He had always been his own harshest critic, and this battle within himself had been one of his most challenging struggles. Linda could sense the tension in the air when she walked into the room. She had been watching Frank closely over the past few weeks, noticing that while he had made significant strides physically and mentally, there was still a lingering sense of frustration in him. "Something's bothering you," she said softly, her eyes meeting his. Frank hesitated for a moment before answering. "I don't know. I feel like I'm not doing enough. Like I'm not pushing myself hard enough, you know. I've been slowing down, listening to my body, but it doesn't feel like enough. I feel like I'm falling behind." Linda sat down across from him, her expression gentle but firm. "Frank, you've been pushing yourself for years. You've done so much, but sometimes, the hardest thing is to acknowledge that the real battle is inside your head, not in your muscles or your routines." Frank looked down, his hands gripping his coffee cup tightly. "I know I've made progress. I know that slowing down is important. But there's still this voice in my head telling me that if I'm not constantly working harder, I'm failing. It's like I can never be satisfied with what I've done." Linda reached across the table, placing her hand over his. "That voice is a part of you, Frank, but it doesn't define who you are. You've spent so much of your life listening to it, and it's made you believe that if you're not constantly pushing, you're falling short. But you have to realize that you are enough, just as you are. And progress is not just about physical strength, it's also about mental strength. Learning to silence that voice is just as important as any workout you've ever done. Her words hit him harder than he expected. For the first time, Frank felt a shift inside. He had spent so much of his life trying to quiet that voice by pushing himself harder and harder. But now, he saw that true strength came not from battling the voice, but from understanding it and choosing to rise above it. That afternoon, Frank decided to go for a walk in the park, alone. He needed space to think, to clear his head. As he walked along the familiar path, he felt the weight of the internal conflict pressing down on him. The voice inside his head was relentless, urging him to do more, achieve more, be more. But Frank began to realize something: the more he tried to silence the voice, the more powerful it became. It wasn't until he stopped fighting it that he could hear it for what it truly was, a reflection of his own fears and insecurities. Frank paused by a bench, taking a deep breath. He closed his eyes and focused on the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. Slowly, he allowed himself to let go of the tension in his body and mind, releasing the need to constantly prove himself. For the first time in a long while, Frank simply allowed himself to be. To exist without the pressure of expectation. He sat down on the bench, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face, and he realized that he didn't have to be at war with himself. The battle inside wasn't something to fight, it was something to understand. When he returned home later that day, he felt lighter, more at peace. He shared his thoughts with Linda, who listened with the quiet understanding that had become her trademark. "I think I finally get it," Frank said, his voice calmer than it had been in weeks. "The voice is always going to be there, but it doesn't have to control me. It's just a part of me, and I can choose how to respond to it. I don't have to keep pushing to prove that I'm enough." Linda smiled, her eyes filled with warmth. "That's exactly it, Frank. You don't have to prove anything to anyone, not to me, not to yourself. You've already proven that you're strong, not just in your body, but in your mind. And that's the real victory." As the days passed, Frank's perspective began to shift. The internal battle didn't disappear overnight, but he learned to quiet the voice of self-doubt and replace it with something far more empowering: self-acceptance. He continued his workouts, but he no longer measured his worth by how much weight he could lift or how quickly he could recover. Instead, he focused on enjoying the journey, celebrating the small victories, and embracing the peace that came with knowing he was enough, exactly as he was. In time, Frank came to understand that the real strength didn't lie in how much he could endure. It came from the courage to face the voice of fear and insecurity, and to rise above it with compassion and understanding. Frank had spent the last few months immersing himself in the new balance he had found. His knee, once a constant reminder of his vulnerability, had become stronger, and his body was thriving with less strain. Most importantly, his mind had found a level of peace he hadn't known in years. He no longer lived under the suffocating pressure of constant self-improvement. But Frank knew, deep down, that life had a way of throwing curveballs, testing the lessons you thought you had learned. That curveball came one Saturday afternoon, when Linda suggested they take a day trip to the mountains. They had been talking about it for a while, a quiet weekend to get away from the noise of the city, to breathe in fresh air and clear their heads. The idea was perfect. Frank had been feeling great, and the thought of a few peaceful hours in nature sounded like just what he needed. But what was meant to be a relaxing escape soon turned into something far more challenging. As they hiked up one of the trails, the terrain became more difficult. The path was rocky and steep, but nothing that Frank couldn't handle, at least, that's what he thought. They had reached the summit of the small peak when Frank felt the familiar, unwelcome twinge in his knee. It wasn't as sharp as before, but it was enough to make him pause, carefully adjust his stance, and take a few extra seconds before continuing. Linda noticed immediately. "Are you okay?" she asked, concern in her voice. Frank smiled through the discomfort, waving her off. "Yeah, it's fine. Just a little tight. No big deal. But deep down, he knew it wasn't just the tightness. It was the fear. The fear that his body wasn't as strong as he wanted it to be. The fear that he had pushed too hard, too fast. The fear that he wasn't as invincible as he had tried to convince himself. They continued on, but the pain in Frank's knee grew sharper with each step. The path, once an exciting adventure, now felt like an obstacle. Every step he took seemed to demand more effort than the last. And with each passing moment, Frank's internal conflict resurfaced. Am I failing? Am I pushing too hard again? Linda, who had been walking ahead, stopped and turned around. She could tell by his expression that something was wrong. Frank, let's slow down. It's okay to take a break. But Frank was determined to keep going. He had pushed through so many challenges before, and this wasn't going to be the one that made him quit. He couldn't let himself fall behind. He refused to show weakness, not even to Linda. I'm fine, really, he insisted, forcing a smile. I just need a minute. Linda didn't argue. She knew Frank well enough to understand that sometimes, he needed to face things on his own terms. But she couldn't help feeling a bit worried as she watched him struggle to mask his pain. She stayed by his side, walking at a slower pace to allow him some space, but keeping an eye on him nonetheless. They reached a small clearing where they could rest for a moment, and Frank collapsed onto a rock, breathing heavily. The pain in his knee wasn't just physical, it was a weight on his mind. He had worked so hard to get to this point, to overcome his insecurities and his fears. But in this moment, he felt like he was failing. Linda sat next to him, gently placing her hand on his shoulder. Frank, I know you don't want to hear this, but it's okay to rest. We're not in a race. This isn't about proving anything to anyone. Not to me, and certainly not to yourself. Frank looked at her, his face a mixture of frustration and vulnerability. I don't know what's wrong with me. I thought I had gotten past this. I thought I had learned to listen to my body, but now, I feel like I'm right back where I started, weak, scared, and out of control. Linda took a deep breath, trying to choose her words carefully. You haven't lost everything, Frank. You've come so far. And there's no shame in slowing down when you need to. In fact, that might be the most courageous thing you can do right now. It's not about the physical challenge, it's about giving yourself permission to be human. Frank's mind raced. The pressure of pushing through, of achieving, of proving himself, had been so ingrained in him that it felt almost impossible to let go. But as he sat there on the rock, listening to Linda's words, he began to feel the truth in them. It wasn't about denying his weakness, it was about accepting it and learning to move forward despite it. I've been afraid, Frank admitted, his voice shaky. Afraid that if I slow down, I'll lose everything. I'll stop moving forward. And I'll be stuck again. Linda smiled gently. The only way to move forward is to know when to take a step back. You can't pour from an empty cup. If you push yourself too hard, you'll burn out. But if you give yourself the space to rest, you'll come back stronger. Frank nodded slowly, feeling the weight of her words sink in. For the first time, he felt a sense of clarity. His journey wasn't a straight line, it was full of ebbs and flows, moments of pushing and moments of rest. It was all part of the process. I guess I've been afraid of what happens if I stop pushing, Frank confessed, his voice soft. But maybe stopping is just as important as going. Maybe that's where the real strength lies. Linda placed a hand on his arm. Exactly. Strength isn't just about how far you can push yourself. It's about how well you know when to push, and when to rest. And that's something you've learned over time. This is just another moment to practice it. Frank sat there for a while, allowing himself to breathe, to accept the discomfort in his knee, and to rest. The pressure of constantly proving himself began to loosen its grip, and he felt a sense of peace wash over him. It wasn't about never having setbacks, it was about how he handled them when they came. As they began their descent down the trail, Frank moved more slowly, but he moved with a sense of calm. He wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone anymore. He was simply moving forward, one step at a time. And for the first time in a long while, that felt like enough. Frank woke up that morning with a sense of quiet anticipation. It had been months since that day in the mountains when he had learned to listen to his body, to rest when needed, and to embrace the process rather than the outcome. His knee had healed, and he had continued his routine, mixing strength training with mindful recovery. But today was different. Today, he was scheduled for his annual physical exam. It wasn't just any checkup, it was the moment he had been dreading for years. The moment where his doctor would evaluate his progress, his health, and most likely, his aging body. He could feel the familiar nerves begin to stir as he dressed for the appointment. Despite all the progress he had made, despite the strength he had regained both physically and mentally, he couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability. This was the moment that could potentially reveal the limits of his body, the moment that could force him to confront the possibility that no matter how hard he tried, his body might be failing him after all. Linda had noticed his shift in mood, and as he grabbed his keys and headed toward the door, she offered a reassuring smile. "You've got this, Frank. No matter what the doctor says, you've already come so far. This is just another step in your journey." He smiled back, appreciating her support, but he still couldn't completely shake the feeling of dread that clung to him. The road he had traveled had been long, and though he had gained much in terms of strength and clarity, there was still a lingering fear that he wasn't enough, that he would never be able to escape the limitations of his body. When Frank arrived at the doctor's office, the waiting room was quiet, with only a few patients flipping through magazines. He was called back by a nurse, who took his blood pressure and led him to an examination room. The sterile white walls and the scent of antiseptic brought him right back to those anxious moments he'd had in his younger years, waiting for the diagnosis that could change everything. "Dr. Williams will be in shortly," the nurse said as she left, closing the door behind her. Frank sat on the exam table, his hands gripping the edges. His heart began to race, and despite his best efforts to calm himself, the anxiety was creeping in. Minutes later, Dr. Williams walked in with a warm smile. He was the same doctor Frank had seen for years, and though Frank had never looked forward to these checkups, he trusted him. "Good morning, Frank. How are we feeling today?" Dr. Williams asked, sitting down at his desk with a clipboard in hand. "Good," Frank replied, though his voice betrayed his nerves. I'm a little anxious, actually. I've been working on my health a lot, but I guess I'm still worried about what you'll find." Dr. Williams chuckled softly, setting the clipboard down. "I get it. It's normal to feel that way, especially when you've put so much effort into making changes. But you've been making progress, Frank. I'm excited to see where you're at now." Frank nodded, but the uncertainty still lingered. His mind raced, cycling through all the possibilities. What if his body wasn't as strong as he thought? What if the years of training and pushing himself weren't enough? What if, despite all his effort, he had reached the point of no return? The doctor conducted a thorough exam, checking Frank's blood pressure, heart rate, and various physical markers. He asked questions about his diet, sleep patterns, and activity levels. Frank answered each one with a mixture of pride and uncertainty. He knew he had made changes, significant changes, but the outcome of those changes was still unknown. Finally, Dr. Williams sat down, his face thoughtful. "Frank, based on your exam, you're in great shape for your age. Your blood pressure is normal, your cholesterol levels are within healthy ranges, and your muscle tone is excellent. In fact, you've improved since last year. Your body is responding well to your new routine." A wave of relief washed over Frank, but it was quickly replaced with a sense of confusion. "But, what about my knee? I still feel it sometimes, especially when I push too hard." Dr. Williams smiled knowingly. "That's to be expected, especially with the kind of physical activity you're doing. You've done an excellent job with recovery, but remember, your body isn't invincible. The key is learning to listen to it, to respect its limits, and to keep working in a way that challenges you without overtaxing it. Frank nodded slowly, absorbing the doctor's words. He had always feared the limitations of his body, the signs of aging that he couldn't control. But here was a doctor telling him that his body was doing well, that he was making smart choices. He was stronger than he had been in years, both physically and mentally. "Frank," Dr. Williams said, his tone shifting to one of encouragement, "you're in control of your health. The power to stay strong, to continue growing, is in your hands. It's about making smart choices, choosing the right challenges and knowing when to rest. You're not the same person you were a year ago. Your approach to fitness is evolving, and that's a good thing. Keep going, but remember, it's all about balance." As Frank left the doctor's office, a sense of clarity began to settle over him. The fear he had carried into the appointment had been based on an old mindset, the belief that his body was fragile, that he was somehow destined to fail as he aged. But the reality was far different. He had made remarkable progress. His body had adapted, had become stronger, and was responding to the care he had given it. The key wasn't in avoiding age or limitations, it was in embracing the process, in choosing to approach his health with mindfulness, patience, and strength. Linda met him outside the office, a concerned look on her face as she saw the mixed emotions on Frank's face. "How did it go?" she asked. "It went better than I expected," Frank said, a smile slowly forming. "I'm doing great. My knee's a little sensitive, but nothing I can't manage. It's all about balance now." Linda smiled, her eyes warm with pride. "I knew it. You've worked so hard to get here, and now you're learning how to move forward the right way." Frank took a deep breath, feeling lighter than he had in weeks. "It's all about choices, Linda. The power is in the choices we make. I can keep pushing myself, but I need to choose when to rest, when to challenge myself, and when to just be." As they walked away from the doctor's office, Frank felt a sense of peace he hadn't known before. The road ahead wasn't about avoiding the inevitable challenges of aging. It was about making the conscious choice to embrace every part of the journey, and to continue growing stronger with every step. The morning sunlight filtered through the window, casting a soft glow across the room. Frank woke up slowly, the sense of tranquility in his heart almost unfamiliar. It had been a few weeks since his checkup, and the changes in his life were no longer just physical. His mind, once consumed with anxiety and self-doubt, had found a new kind of clarity, a balance that allowed him to live fully in each moment. Today was different. It wasn't marked by any extraordinary event, no grand milestone. It was a regular day, but it felt special, a quiet celebration of how far he had come. As he sat up in bed and stretched, he noticed how his body felt different. Not just stronger, but freer. There was a sense of ease that hadn't been there before, a sense of acceptance. His knee, once the source of his frustration and fear, felt stable. It wasn't perfect, but it didn't define him anymore. Frank had learned to move in a way that respected its limitations, to honor his body and its needs. He wasn't chasing after some unattainable ideal of strength, he was simply moving forward, one step at a time. Linda walked into the room, a cup of coffee in hand, and smiled when she saw Frank sitting on the edge of the bed, deep in thought. "You're up early," she said, her voice warm. "Yeah, I couldn't sleep," Frank replied, looking out the window. "Just thinking about everything, you know. How much has changed. How far I've come." Linda sat next to him, handing him the cup of coffee. "You've come a long way, Frank. I'm really proud of you." Frank smiled, but his thoughts were still clouded by a sense of reflection. "It's crazy how much has shifted, isn't it? It feels like just yesterday I was struggling, thinking I had to push harder and harder to make something of myself. But now, it's different. I don't feel the pressure anymore." Linda took a sip of her coffee, her eyes thoughtful. "It's amazing what happens when you let go of that pressure. When you stop trying to outrun your fears and just allow yourself to be where you are." Frank nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. Yeah. I think the hardest part was learning that I didn't have to be perfect. I didn't have to always be striving for the next big thing, the next goal, the next milestone. I just needed to focus on today. And make the right choices for myself. Linda smiled, resting her hand on his. That's the secret, Frank. It's not about the destination, it's about the journey. And you're living it, every single day. Frank leaned back against the pillows, allowing the truth of her words to settle in. He had spent so many years chasing after an ideal, thinking that strength and success were measured by how much he could endure or achieve. But now, he realized it was about something much deeper. It was about balance. About accepting both the strength and the vulnerability that came with being human. It was about knowing when to push and when to rest, when to strive and when to simply be. In the months since his knee injury, Frank had become more attuned to his body, more aware of what it needed. His workouts were no longer just about pushing limits, they were about respecting the limits. And the same applied to his life. The stress and pressure that once weighed him down had gradually lifted as he learned to let go of expectations and embrace the present moment. Linda, Frank said, his voice steady, I don't think I'll ever stop learning. But I feel like I'm in a place now where I can keep moving forward, no matter what comes. I'm not afraid anymore. At least, not in the same way. Linda smiled, her eyes full of understanding. You've always had the strength within you, Frank. You just needed to believe it. Frank let out a deep breath, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. The past few years had been a roller coaster, full of highs and lows, struggles and triumphs. But now, as he looked back, he saw a clear picture, one of growth. Of gradual, steady transformation. He had faced his fears, his physical limitations, and his doubts, and he had come through stronger for it. But more than that, he had found peace with himself, with the person he was becoming. The truth was, there would always be challenges ahead. There would always be moments when his knee flared up, or when his body didn't feel quite as strong as it once did. But Frank no longer felt defeated by these moments. He felt equipped to handle them with patience, with grace. And that made all the difference. As he looked at Linda, he realized how much her support had meant in this journey. She had stood by him, encouraging him when he faltered, never pushing him to be anything he wasn't. She had been his partner in every sense of the word, not just in moments of celebration, but in the quiet, challenging moments when he felt like giving up. And for that, he was deeply grateful. I couldn't have done this without you, Frank said, his voice sincere. You've been there every step of the way. Linda squeezed his hand. We've done it together, Frank. That's what life is about. It's not about doing it all alone, it's about finding the right people to walk with you. Frank smiled, feeling the truth of her words. Life wasn't about perfection or endless striving. It was about balance, connection, and making choices that honored who you truly were. It was about embracing the journey, with all its ups and downs, and trusting that every step, no matter how small, was a step in the right direction. As he stood up from the bed, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face, Frank made a decision. He wasn't going to wait for the perfect moment. He wasn't going to put off his happiness or growth for some distant future. He was going to live now, right now. And he was going to continue embracing the lessons he had learned along the way. He turned to Linda, his eyes full of resolve. Let's take that hike today. But this time, we'll do it at our own pace, no pressure. Just, us. And the journey. Linda's face lit up with a smile, and together, they headed out the door, ready to take on whatever the future held. Because Frank had finally learned that it wasn't about the destination, it was about how you chose to travel the road. And with that, he stepped forward, into a new beginning. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?